My name is Lynn Vavrick, and I'm a professor in the Political Science Department here at UCLA. On behalf of Jeff Lewis, who is with us tonight, the chair of the Political Science Department, I want to welcome you to the first You Heard It Here lecture of 2015. As many of you know, this lecture series showcases UCLA faculty and alumni for a broad audience of interested citizens like you. Tonight, we're delighted to have with us two young professionals who have accomplished and achieved very much, but who are on the cusp of even greater achievements. One, a journalist and author who has covered 2 presidential campaigns and written several books on economics and politics. And the other, an NFL football player and author whose courage on and off the field demonstrate the remarkable impact that UCLA's principles of community can have on a Bruin. Chris Kluwe graduated from UCLA with a degree in political science and history in 2005. He also played some football. While a Bruin, Chris set records for total punt yardage and total number of punts. As a Minnesota Viking, he set many more. He has spoken out in support of same-sex marriage and started conversations in locker rooms and front offices and among sports fans around the world about LGBT issues in athletics. He is the author of a book of essays called Beautifully Unique Sparkle Ponies and a new novel called Prime that just dropped last week. He plays multiple musical instruments, enjoys gaming, and recently gave a TED Talk on the use of virtual reality technologies as a tool for building a more empathetic society among actual reality people. Chris is the Bruin that we all strive to be. He works to create and live in communities that honor dignity and are not defined by intolerance. He is a true Bruin. Please join me in welcoming Chris back to UCLA. Here tonight to talk with Chris about all of these ideas is Sasha Issenberg. Sasha is a contributor to Bloomberg Politics and the Washington correspondent for Monocle, an international global affairs magazine. He covered the 2012 presidential election for Slate and the 2008 election for the Boston Globe. One of journalism's best raconteurs, Sasha has told the story of Barack Obama's reliance on big data in his book called The Victory Lab, and is now working on a book about the history of same-sex marriage in America called The Engagement. Sasha, too, has a connection to UCLA. He has spent the last year as a research fellow in the School of Public Affairs and the Division of Social Sciences, where he has been working in the archives and teaching undergraduates about the role of media in today's political environment. Both authors' books will be for sale in the foyer outside the hall after the lecture, and we will also have a reception after the lecture, which we invite you all to join us for. Please enjoy this conversation between 2 compelling and thoughtful gentlemen, and I will now turn the program over to Sasha Issenberg.
Thank you. Thank you, Lynn. As you can tell, I am not the professional football player.
It's the T-shirt that gives it away.
So I first became familiar with your interest in politics when you had this letter, public letter to a Maryland state delegate who had been critical of a player on the Ravens who'd been vocal about the marriage initiative, and this was in the fall of 2012. In that letter, you mentioned that you've been outspoken before about gay marriage. I was sort of wondering, what had you been doing before, and what led you, what was the sort of thinking on your part about what you do speak out on? Because I would imagine that the calculus as a professional player attached to a team is different than it would be if you were a public citizen thinking about whether you want to be a public spokesman on an issue.
So growing up, like, I wasn't an angel growing up. You know, I was raised in, born in 1981, grew up in the 90s. So as a kid, as a teenager, my views on same-sex rights, same-sex marriage were very much, a 90s kid, like, oh, that's lame. Why should we care about gay people? But then as I grew older, I understood, wait a minute, why shouldn't we care about gay people? Like, this is important. These are U.S. citizens too. Like, these are people that deserve to be treated just like everybody else. They deserve the same rights as everyone else. And so I made a conscious effort to change who I was and to move past sort of these societal mores that were a part of me growing up. And then when I was a member of the Vikings, the year of, I think it was 2012 was when I started speaking out on this, a group contacted me on Twitter, social media. So social media can do good things every once in a while. but no, they contacted me and said, hey, there's this amendment coming up in Minnesota that would put a constitutional ban on same-sex marriage in the state. And I was like, hold on a minute, that doesn't sound right. That doesn't sound what America is about. And so they asked me, would you be willing to get involved with this? And in my mind, I was like, well, yeah, because if I want someone else to speak out for me when I'm in trouble, then I need to be willing to do the same when it's someone else who it's their life on the line. And so at that point, I was like, well, okay, yeah, I'm committed to this. I'm going to make sure that we defeat this amendment, and hopefully my voice will help do that, because you generally don't hear a lot about football players speaking out on political
And so
issues.
practically, like, do you talk to your agent, or do you check with somebody at the franchise, or, okay.
Okay. One caveat, I did check with the franchise. I said, I told them, hey, I'm interested in doing this, and I would like to do this, and said, that's fine, you just need to make it clear that you're doing this as a private citizen, not speaking for the Vikings. And so I was always very careful to be, this is me, Chris Kluwe, speaking out on these things, not the Minnesota Vikings take this position, therefore you should believe this, which I felt was fair. I mean, I don't think it's really the best idea for a society that values free speech and ethics, because essentially you're putting the accumulation of money over the rights of individuals. But that was the team's stance. And I was like, okay, I understand where you're coming from, and so I will abide by that, because I do want to be able to make an impact. And being cut means you don't really have the same platform than if you're an active player speaking out on these issues.
And were you conscious of the idea that there was a professional cost to doing it or doing it wrong?
Yeah. Oh yeah. No, I knew that this could cost me my career, and it did end up costing me my career. I hoped it wouldn't, but at the same time, I knew if you're an athlete, the vast majority of people want you to shut up and play sports. Like they don't want to listen about societal issues. They don't want to listen about politics, because when they're watching sports, sports are entertainment. They want to tune out from the rest of the world. They want to forget about how crappy the world is around them and just watch their favorite team win or lose. Like that's what they're there for. And so when you see athletes speaking out, that's why people tend to get so irate, because they feel as if this bubble is being invaded by the real world. And in my mind, I'm like, sometimes your bubble needs to be invaded by the real world. Like, your life can't just be entertainment. You have to think about these issues, because they are important issues.
Well, would things have played out differently if you'd been more prominent? I mean, if Brett Favre had done what you'd done.
Oh, yeah.
What would have been different?
If I was a quarterback, I would not have been cut. It's very easy to cut the punter. It's not so easy to cut like the starting wide receiver, defensive lineman. And I mean, but that's one of the things in sports, is that there always is kind of that caste system where you have, in baseball, like you have your starting pitchers. They can get away with a lot more than, say, your backup outfielder. Like that guy kind of needs to keep his mouth shut. As a punter, you're always going to be the low man on the totem pole, because people consider your job to not be as necessary as the other jobs. Now, I've seen games won and lost on punts, so you are kind of necessary. But again, people think quarterbacks, receivers, linebackers, defensive linemen. Those are real football players, and and that's fine. People can think whatever they want. But at the same time, if I have that platform, even if it does cost me that, I'm still going to speak out on it, because it is the right thing to do, and it's what I want someone else to do if I was one who needed help.
And how quickly did you realize that the team or parts of the franchise were not looking favorably upon?
Probably the first game of the season, when the head coach called me into his office and said, I need you to stop talking about this. I was like, well, hold on a second here, because I am talking about this on my own time. And and actually the owner came up the first game. So the timeline was the day before the first game. That was the day after my Deadspin article had gone out and went viral, a ton of people talking about it. The head coach calls me into his office, says, you need to stop talking about this. You just can't talk about this anymore. I'm like, no, I can't do that. Like, I'm going to talk about this, because I think it's the right thing to do. And he said, fine, I can't be held responsible for what happens. So going into the first game of the season, I'm kind of just like, oh, great. this is going to suck. First game, the next day, the owner comes up during pregame and says, hey, Chris, I think you're doing a great thing, keep it up. So in my mind, I'm like, okay, conflicting messages here. So then after the game, that Monday afterwards, I went to the head coach and said, look, here's what happened. The owner came up to me and said he appreciates what I'm doing, so how do you want to proceed? And then our interactions became a little stilted from that point on. But no, it was one of those things where I just, there were definitely people who wanted me to do it, and there were people who didn't want me to do it. And I think that it's just a reflection of society as a whole, because in society itself, we have people who are for same-sex rights, and we have people who are against same-sex rights. And there's this idea, going back to that earlier point of like sports being a bubble, there's this idea that sports teams are this, thing outside of society, that somehow it's just athletes and coaches and that's all they do, they play sports, but it's not. It's made up of people who grow up in different circumstances, who grow up in different families, who have different worldviews, and they all comprise the members of your favorite sports team. So you're going to have that wide variety of views. You're going to have a diverse array of characters. And to think that players are going to put that aside just because they play a game, that's a little naive, because at the end of the day, we're human beings.
I mean, so we tend to talk about, and there's since Michael Sam and Jason Collins, there's been a big talk about homosexuality in sports and team sports in general, right? But it seems like sports are very different, even among the 4 or 5 big team sports of this country. Just you look demographically. I mean, you have players coming from geographically different roots, racially, religiously, and I feel like we don't. I would imagine that if you look at the NHL, where you have a significant portion of people from Canada and northern states that have been relatively progressive on gay rights, as opposed to a league that's pulling disproportionately from parts of the country that haven't been. What's your sense of sort of what the culture is in the NFL that's distinctive to the NFL around gay politics, and what's your view on how that might be different than the NBA or Major League Baseball or hockey?
So I think for the NFL, the locker room tends to swing more in favor of same-sex rights, because the locker room is comprised of young men who are growing up in a modern society that has said, we think same-sex rights are an important thing for people to have. And again, it's not a bubble. These are kids who've grown up with gay relatives. And not just gay relatives, openly gay relatives. They have openly gay friends. They've had openly gay teammates, which does a huge amount towards bringing the conversation forward, because now it's not this feared thing that no one knows, oh, what's a gay person like? It's like, no, I have an uncle who's gay. He's my uncle. Or, I have a friend who's gay. He's my friend. And so in the players, I'd say it's probably like 60-40. Maybe 65-35. Which is probably right about along the lines of the country right now. You see it in the demographic polling on these issues. It tends to be the younger generation favors it, older generations don't. Unfortunately, in the NFL, the vast majority of the front offices and the owners are old, white, rich men. No offense to the old, white, rich men in the audience.
I hope to be one day. So, yeah.
But that tends to be the kind of, let's say, the holdbacks or the throwbacks that really don't see this issue as something that they think should be important. And until that changes, I mean, it's the same thing with with slavery, with civil rights, with suffrage. Until that older generation dies out and the younger generation replaces them, you don't see really drastic changes. I mean, you see some changes because you're constantly shifting, you're constantly building up, but until that older generation simply isn't there anymore and they're not in positions of power, then it's tough to change things. Because in an NFL front office, yeah, you can have, like, say, maybe a scout thinks that this is something great, and maybe there's one of the assistant coaches thinks this is great. But if the head coach and the GM and the owner don't think that that's great, well, there's not a whole lot you can do. And by and large, the GMs and the owners and the head coaches are like, either they don't agree with it or they just don't want to talk about it, because again, that corporate mindset of we want to make money, therefore we don't want to offend anyone, therefore don't talk about anything.
Did players either on your team or on other teams want to talk to you about it?
Oh yeah. No, I had when my Deadspin article came out, I'd say probably about 35 guys in the locker room came up, and talked to me about it, and it was about a 60-40 split. So I had about 60% came up and said, hey, we think you're doing the right thing. This is awesome, good job. Then about 40% came up and said, we may not necessarily agree with you on the same-sex rights issue, but thanks for speaking out in support of Brendan, because free speech is fairly important. Like that's something that is one of the cornerstones of our society. And so to me, the thing I thought was interesting and the thing I made very sure of was that I wasn't trying to corner guys in their lockers. I wasn't the preacher on the mount that like, you have to talk about this. It was, if you want to talk about this, I am more than happy to do so, but I'm not going to shove it in your face while we're at the facility because right now we're there for football. And I understand that some of you may not want to talk about this. So why should I distract you from your job when I wouldn't want you, telling me to shut up about stuff, away from my job. So again, it's being respectful of the people around you.
I mean, generally, are athletes, when you guys are on the road and you're at a hotel somewhere and you're not on the clock, are you guys talking about politics?
Oh, we talk about everything. And that's one of the funny things about the locker room is that, so you're at a football locker room usually from about maybe 7:30 in the morning till about 5:30 in the evening. So you're there for a pretty long time. It's like 8, 9, 10-hour days. And there's a lot of film studies, there's a lot of practice, a lot of lifting weights, but there's also a lot of downtime. So there's time in between film studies where you have 15, 20 minutes, everyone's just hanging out. Before practice, there's 30 minutes, everyone's getting ready, hanging out. After lunch, there's 40 minutes, people are hanging out. So just like any other work environment, guys gather around and they talk about things, they pass the time. And I mean, we had guys talk about taxes, we had guys talk about politics, we had guys talk about, racial relations. There are a lot of very interesting conversations that go on in the locker room. There's a lot of very stupid conversations that go on in the locker room. But, just like any grouping of people, you're going to talk about the news that is kind of at the forefront of the public mind because you are a part of that public. You go home, you read the newspaper, you watch television, and so you know about these issues, and other guys know about these issues, so you talk about them.
And so when Michael Sam came out, and there was a question about whether he'd be drafted, I guess there were a few players who got in some form of trouble for tweeting or making remarks. But by and large, it seemed like most of the players who had anything to say were positive or accepting. Is the private conversation on something like that, on actually having a gay player in the league, going to be different than what we are seeing in these sort of public declarations?
The private conversation, guys will tend to be a bit more open about what they're saying. So, like the guys who are saying publicly on Twitter, we don't want a gay guy, privately they're saying, hell no, I don't want this guy in the locker room. I'm not showering with a gay, using a very derogatory term instead of the word gay. Whereas other guys will be like, yeah, what's the big deal? I mean, as long as he can do his job, who cares? We're all showering together anyways. And if I can get to the shower point, because that's something I hear so often, there have been gay players in the NFL. That is a fact. There's been multiple gay players in the NFL. If being a gay player in the NFL led to spontaneous shower room orgies, fairly certain we would have heard about that by now. So I think people need to get over the fact that, there's this idea that, there's all these men showering together and a gay guy's not going to be able to control himself. It's like, well, no, it's not going to happen. You're in a work environment. So deal with it. Get over your own phobias.
So you were talking about the change in slavery and other issues taking time. And so I'm writing a history of the battles over gay marriage in the U.S., and one of the things I'm trying to do is figure out how to describe the nature of that political and legal change. But when you look at public opinion, one of the things that drew me to the subject is that the change is so rapid and so compressed. And one way to look at it is obviously through polling. And basically in the last 10, 12 years, the percentage of people in the United States who support just gay marriage rights have doubled, right? From right around 30% to now it looks like right around 60%. It seems like you have probably a different way of understanding that change in that starting in 2012,
right,
you're hearing from people in probably a variety of different ways about their attitudes. I was wondering, like, your personal perspective, because I think now, I was going back and rereading your post on Deadspin and the stuff around it, and just the sort of ambient attitudes around gay marriage. It was a far more controversial issue 2.5 years ago in ways that are sort of hard to remember now. And that's not that long ago, right?
My agent said I should have waited a year.
And so much in our politics is identically the same 2.5 years later, but that seemed like a very radical position now. And now I have the feeling that if, like, Tom Brady at a post-Super Bowl press conference had made a pro-gay marriage statement, albeit his probably a lot less articulate than yours and with a lot more like bro and whatever, but like
probably a lot less swearing too.
it probably would have been fairly unremarkable. I don't think people would have said like, wow, like this is a crazy, like radical leftist. So how do you see what's happened in that just 2.5, 3 years? And how do you understand how that movement has taken place?
Well, I think a lot of it goes back to the idea, well, I mean, Stonewall, first off, that was a generation ago. Like that is, that's a generational change right there from people who participated in, the Stonewall riots versus where we're at today. So that gives you an entire, that's decades of people growing up with the idea, AIDS all of a sudden is no longer this gay disease. This is a legit medical disease, and it's not, this harbinger of gay depravity. It's, no, this is something that happens. People get AIDS, straight, gay, whatever, it doesn't matter. And so I think a lot of people have the idea that same-sex rights is something that's only been a battle for, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, but it actually has been longer than that. It's been a 30-year, 40-year battle, and so we're seeing that generational change happening right now. Like I said before, we're seeing kids growing up in a world where it's okay to have openly gay friends. It's okay to have openly gay relatives. Depending on which part of the country you grow up in. I mean, there are still very many parts of the country where that's not okay, but there are many more where it is okay. And I think a lot of it too, the rapid change has to deal with social media and the internet, because now it is much easier to get in contact with people who share the same views and who have stories to tell about what it's like. And so if you are a gay kid growing up in Mississippi or something like that, yeah, your surrounding town is probably going to be a pretty crappy place, but you can go on the internet and say, California looks really cool. New York looks really cool. Like I know of these places. I can talk to people in these places. I can interact, and I know that it's out there, and that gives me that courage to keep going. Whereas before, it's like, well, shoot, I'm going to have a really crappy life. And I think that's also where I don't have the numbers, but the suicide rates, I believe, are going down for gay individuals because, and again, this is just wild conjecture right here, but the fact when you can talk to other people, when you're not isolated and alone, it makes it much easier to have a support network. And the internet does a lot for that because it allows you to reach out and touch someone. I mean, it very much is. And that is the beneficial power of social media. Now, the negative downside of that is it becomes much easier for people to harass you, which is, something else you have to learn to deal with. But I think as a whole, we're seeing kind of that accelerated part of what began 30 years ago, 40 years ago, and we're seeing it sort of accelerate due to what wasn't available in previous social movements, which is the internet and social media, that interconnectivity.
And do you feel like you being outspoken on this as a professional athlete is seen now as less controversial than it was when you did it?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's something. I mean, my agent really did have a point. If I'd waited a year, then if Michael Sam comes out, Jason Collins comes out, and then I write something, right? Yeah, Deadspin was like, yeah, whatever. Maybe it gets like 100,000 views. That's it. It's not in the millions. But I really. But then the question becomes, if I don't write that, do Michael Sam and Jason Collins come out? Because it does take people willing to put yourself out there and say, look, I know this could cost me, but I know it's the right thing to do. And that's the thing, is that's what we all need to do, is if we want to live in a truly just society, is recognize the fact that when you're in a position of power and other people are not, if you don't speak out for them, there will come a day when you are no longer in a position of power. And if you haven't spoken out for those people, they're probably not going to speak out for you. So it's almost a very self-interested view in that you're really looking out for yourself because you want a society that you can live in where everyone is respected, because that has to include you. It's not just, oh, I'm part of the favored group now, but you might not always be.
So where do things stand between you and the Vikings? Because you've made
That's
some claims and there's an investigation, right?
Yeah.
So, in terms of it's a legal process matter, where are we?
So to settle the lawsuit, there was a fairly large donation to several gay charities that the Vikings did, and then they put new practices into place to handle to prevent the situation that happened with me and my special teams coach from hopefully ever happening again. And other than that,
do you want to just briefly recount what that?
Oh, sure, yeah. I brought up a lawsuit against the Vikings, claiming that they fired me because of discrimination, since my special teams coach was not really a fan of what I was doing, and he used some not good language, and so basically I said, based on my body of work, the season that I had, the only reason that makes sense for you to cut me and to draft a punter in the 5th round is because you're getting rid of me because of my political views. And statistically, that bears out, that my numbers were the same as they were the previous 7 years, and I led the Vikings in every punting category in the team's history. So it's like, okay, what changed? Well, I wrote a letter. But yeah, so anyways, after some legal wrangling and hullabaloo, that all got settled. And I think the Vikings are committed to doing the right thing, but I think it takes nudges and prods for them to stay on that path, just like any corporation. Corporations don't really want to do anything that isn't their bottom line unless they're kind of forced into it.
And so there's I wonder, somebody with socially liberal views, how you see, speaking of corporations with bottom line, how you see the NFL, because the NFL, I think just in the last couple of years has started to be seen as a very reactionary institution in American life in a way that wasn't true even 5 years ago. And I think part of this is the head injuries, and part of it is the domestic abuse issues. But people start, I don't know how this happened, people start talking about the NFL like it's Halliburton or Blackwater or something, right?
Well, I mean, when you look at it, like they are killing their labor force. Like it's kind of messed up. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that the NFL has been very profitable based on not changing many things. They have an incentive to keep things the same because it's a game, right? You want the rules to stay stable, and so that way people have familiarity with their game. They know they're not getting an entirely new product every year. Now, with the concussion issue, with the prescription painkiller drug issue, with everything that's happening in the NFL, they're being forced to adapt what they do, and they haven't had any experience with that. So they don't know how to do it. Like, for example, their domestic violence thing, where they had, we're going to have this big commercial, it's going to be great, we're going to raise awareness. Well, when you look at it, the group that they're giving the money to, all it does is raise awareness. They don't do anything. Like, they don't contribute to any, shelters, or all they do is, we sell merchandise to raise awareness. And it's like, great, raise awareness all you want. If you don't do anything, what's the point? There has to be concrete action behind it. And so I would much rather the NFL said, we've singled out these shelters in these major cities that our teams play in. We're giving each of them $1 million. That is a tangible benefit that will help hundreds, if not thousands of people. And the bottom line would be exactly the same as giving $30 million to a public awareness, essentially a corporate branding group. And that's something where the NFL, it's worked for them in the past. And if people aren't aware of it, it will work for them in the future. Their whole breast cancer awareness thing, like the, wear pink, et cetera, that is a marketing plan to get more women to watch the NFL. That's all it is. It's, I think it's 5% of the money they raise actually goes to breast cancer charities. And so when you look at it, it's like, great, you're raising awareness, but are you actually doing anything? Or is this a marketing ploy? And if it's a marketing ploy, the people watching have to ask themselves, are we okay with that from the product that we consume?
So you still watch football?
I don't. My wife does. She's always. I've actually never. Not to make her feel bad. I've never really been a big sports watcher. I like playing sports. I don't really like watching it because I'd rather be playing it. But for me, it's I don't really like watching football just because I know what it can do to the people involved, and
physically,
physically, emotionally, mentally, and then I also know that behind the scenes stuff, like what happens within the teams, where the team will make it seem like, you guys are going to be best friends for life. Everything's going to be great. And then the instant you're no longer useful to them, you're cut. We never want to hear from you again. And it's like, well, that happens in every team, all 32 teams. You can find a guy who has a story like that. You can find multiple guys who have stories like that.
Are you saying that sort of fans are complicit in the problems of the NFL?
Yeah, I'd say fans are complicit because, and a lot of that too is that the NFL has been feeding fans the idea that you root for a team, you don't root for players, because a team will stay around forever. Players come and go. So if fans root for teams, that means you're probably going to be a fan for life. If you're a fan of a player, you might transfer that to the team. More likely, you're probably going to stop watching once that player's done because there's no longer anything tying you to the game. And so the NFL has a very vested interest in making sure fans root for teams, which is why you see a lot of times when players speak out on issues, you'll see a lot of the major talking heads in sports media start going on about, oh, this guy's selfish. He's not thinking of the team. He's only thinking for himself. he's not a team player. It's like, well, hold on a minute. This guy's doing a job. He's trying to talk about something. He has every right to do his job and try to get as much money as he can because he has to go home, and pay the bills. It's like, what makes the team as a corporation more valuable than the player as an individual? Which I think is a really interesting point that not a lot of people think about.
So, like, what advice would you give to somebody who thinks themselves as politically liberal or progressive? They care about women's issues, they care about public health or consumer safety or wherever we put the concussions issue, and really likes football. Like, what?
It's a tough quandary right now. I'm not gonna lie. There are a couple major issues with football right now that. One of the things you can do is contact your team because they have someone manning their front desk, and that person takes your call. They will listen to your call, and then if they get enough calls, they will pass it up the chain to the GM. They'll pass it up to the CEO or the CFO. Whoever their boss is, they're going to pass that information up to them. And so if enough people call enough teams, the NFL will go, hold on a minute, we have a problem here. We need to fix it. But if not enough people do it, then the NFL will look at it like, well, if people don't care about this problem, why should we fix it? Like that's going to affect our bottom line for no reason. So shoot, why should we fix it? And really the problem with the NFL right now is that it's twofold. It's the fact that whatever you try to do, football is going to be inherently violent. And it's going to be dangerous. And there's simply nothing you can do about concussions. There's no way to pad the inside of someone's head.
You have children, right?
Yes.
Would you let them play football? Or
I
do
would
you let them play football?
Well, they're girls, so they probably won't get the chance.
Okay.
But if
I'm very progressive.
right,
So.
if they wanted to, I would say wait until high school, and I want you to be fully aware of everything that can happen to you because of this. Because I feel a lot of people aren't fully aware. They think, oh, it's just a dinger, I'll walk it off, or I'll be fine later. No, you can get 2-3 concussions, and then that's it. That is permanently damaging you for the rest of your life. And so that's something that the NFL has to find a way around. They have to find a way to make the game safe enough where parents want their children to play football. Because a really interesting thing is you've seen a lot of the ads for like Play 60, go out heads up tackling, the NFL-sponsored initiatives, aimed at kids' youth football. The reason they're doing that is because over the last, I believe it's 2 years, there's been a 20% drop in enrollment in Pee Wee football. So parents are saying, we don't want our kids to play football. The NFL says, holy crap, that's going to kill us. So now that's why you start seeing all these marketing campaigns. And that's a very thorny problem that I don't know if the NFL is ever going to be able to solve. And as a society, it comes down to what do we value? Do we value entertainment where the people participating in that entertainment, some of them will end up maimed? I mean, that's just the bottom line. You're going to have players who will develop dementia. It's an NFL player's likelihood of developing ALS is 8 times the chance of a normal person's chance of developing ALS. So I mean, there are physical drawbacks to playing this game. On the other hand, there are very large rewards to playing the game, monetary rewards primarily, that some people will make that decision. They'll say, you know what, I will give up these future years of my life in order to have this now so I can provide for the people around me. And honestly, one of the things the NFL could really do to get the public back on their good graces is be like, we're going to take care of the guys who get injured playing our game. Because that was one of the huge fights of the concussion settlement is you have these guys who are killing themselves playing the game back in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And the NFL said, not our problem. You're not playing for us anymore. We're not going to cover your medical care. And it's like, how do you not see that's a public relations disaster? Like, take care of your people. And so but again, that's the bottom line. The NFL said we value the money more than spending it on taking care of these guys, and now they're seeing how that backfired in that, okay, now we have to spend a whole lot more on both taking care of them and in fighting this negative press. So that, that's something that if they really start taking care of guys, I think you'll see that start to dwindle down a bit because then guys will know it's an informed choice and they know they'll be taken care of if something bad happens. The other major issue for the NFL right now is the stadium issue. That's something that's really going to start.
Public funding?
Yes, public funding for stadiums is because the NFL is a multi-billion-dollar industry. I think it was what, $10 billion, $11 billion last year in terms of, I think that was profit. And then they're projected to be $19 billion by 2017, 2018. So this is a business that is making more than enough money to build their own stadiums. Yet you hear, I mean, case in point, Inglewood just had a public official say, we need to get this stadium in here. And it's like, well, hold on a minute. Why can't the NFL pay for that stadium? Because historically speaking, stadiums tend to be public boondoggles. You don't really recoup your investment on stadiums. They're, yeah, you might get some people coming in to watch games, but over the life of the stadium, you're not making that money back if it's publicly funded. So if the NFL wants to develop those stadiums, that's great. Let the NFL do it. But if it's public funding, while you're laying off teachers, while critical infrastructure is crumbling, probably not a good investment. So
how interested are you personally at this stage in your life in using your prominence as a public figure and activist to reform the NFL as opposed to, I mean, you're talking about the plight of gay teenagers in wherever you said was crappy, Mississippi?
Yeah,
the crappy state you said?
Take your pick of the South. It's not good.
I figure you could either spend your time dealing with gay rights, for example, around the country, or you could say, I actually can be fairly prominent, like calling for the NFL to... Do you see that as a useful focus of your activist energies to focus on the NFL, or are other public concerns sort of more interesting to you?
I try to be widely varied in what I'm looking at. So I mean, gay rights was a very important issue. I think we're slowly cresting the hump on that to where it doesn't require quite as much activism in terms of the general populace being involved, because I think we're probably a year away from the Supreme Court saying on a federal level, same-sex rights, gay rights, you have to acknowledge this. And then that'll put everything to bed in terms of the states going, no, we don't want to do this. But however, there is one big fight still left to do, and that is trans rights. That's very important. That's something that we haven't really been talking about much as a country. And then also employment rights as a gay person. That's going to be the next big hurdle, because I want to say it's there's still 29 states where you can be fired from your job simply for your sexuality, and that's not right. That's not just. So that's what we need to work on that front. In terms of the NFL, I'm interested in the NFL stuff because so many people in America are interested in the NFL. And so if you can get the NFL to adopt more progressive leanings, more ethical leanings, then some of that's going to trickle down to the people who watch the NFL, to the people who are interested in the NFL, because they'll be like, oh, wait a minute, if the NFL is doing this, well, why shouldn't we do this? I mean, and that's one of the things as a sports figure, a lot of guys need to understand is that you are a role model, whether you like it or not. There are people who will look up to you simply for your athletic abilities, and what you do with that is up to you. You can use it to be good and do good for the society, or you can say, I got mine, you all try and get yours, which again contributes kind of the opposite effect and leads to a more selfish societal frame.
From a political perspective, among the other major sports leagues, are there ones that you look at as something closer to what a model institution for a professional sports league could be in the NFL?
It's tough. I mean, they all kind of have their advantages and their disadvantages. I think social issues-wise, I'd say the NHL is probably the most progressive in terms of gay rights, same-sex rights, in terms of just being involved with people as opposed to as a business model. Unfortunately, the NHL is also one of the smallest major sports leagues that we have. So, from a business standpoint, it makes more sense to not be involved in these issues because you're going to make more money. But then again, as a business, if the society you're living in ultimately ends up crumbling because people don't care about each other, what use is your money? You got to look at the big picture. I will say one of the things about the NFL that I think is what makes it so popular is that it's this very interesting mix of capitalism and straight communism, where the teams, no, it really is, it's fascinating because every team has the same salary cap. You all have the same resources. Revenue sharing is split equally across the league. What matters is what you do with those resources. And do you throw them all into one superstar player and then try to build a cast around that? I mean, you see that in Detroit. They don't do very well. Sometimes you can make it work, sometimes you can't. Most of the time you can't. Do you adopt more of okay, we're going to get maybe one superstar guy, but then build a roster around it, for cheaper, a more, they're not top tier guys, but they're still pretty good. The Patriots do that very well. They've been very successful with that. And so it's this constant interplay between, also as a player, do I try and grab as much as you can? As a player, yes, you should always try and grab as much as you can because it's a very limited job and there's no telling when you're going to lose it. However, if you do that, that means the team might not win as much because the more resources they tie up in you, the less they have to pursue other people. So do you want to play for yourself, for your family's benefit, or do you play for the glory of a ring? Do you want a championship? And I think that is what that is what gives people the incentive to keep watching the NFL is there's this interplay where every year you feel that your team could have a chance, and it's a legit chance. Unless you're a Browns fan, sorry. Any Browns fans. They're factory of sadness. But no, it really is that every year people feel the team that I root for, they have a chance. It's not like baseball where the Yankees, the Red Sox, the Cardinals, and I forget who the fourth team is. Those teams are always going to be in the playoffs. I think it's the Angels. Those 4 teams are always going to be in the playoffs because they spend more money than everyone else. And so, that's a much more capitalistic system, but it suffers because of that, because if you're not a fan of one of those 4 teams, you have less incentive to watch the game. So, sorry, I got a little off track, but it's to me, it's a really interesting interplay in the sports teams.
So you mentioned the Patriots. I do want to ask you, having been involved in a team investigation of itself.
We found no wrongdoing. Shocking.
So, as you could tell, basically everybody laughed when it seemed like the response to the deflation story was that the team was going to investigate themselves, especially at a sort of precarious moment at the end of the season. How do you, what's your take on should that be seen as anything other than a setup for a whitewash?
No, it's completely sweeping it under the rug. The teams have no interest in discovering what actually went wrong. Because, they'll find a sacrificial victim, they'll throw them under the bus, and then life will go on. That's
how. So in your case, do you know how aggressively they investigated your claims?
I know they investigated me very aggressively.
What does that mean?
So they dug up. I can't say a whole lot because there's a standard legal thing where you can't talk about a lot of the stuff that happens. But they looked up. Essentially, they dug up any dirt they could find on me, and so they released, it was like a 30-page summary of the full report, and of those 30 pages, 29 pages dealt with things that made me look bad, and then 1 page was about my special teams coach. It was like, well, hold on a minute. Who's under investigation here? The person who brought the claim or the person who did the wrongdoing? It's like, you would think the 29 pages would be on the person who did the wrongdoing, but again, that's not in the team's interest. They want to make their token gesture and then have it go away because that way people can then focus back on football.
So you just put out a novel, a science fiction novel, which I haven't read, but we were talking about it before, and you're describing it as 400, 500 years in the future, looking at a government that can control access to data and what that means for society. So I thought I would ask you a political science fiction question. Maybe not that far in the future, but I'm wondering...
Free Barrett Brown?
One thing that's remarkable to me writing about the recent history of gay marriage is that this, not too long ago, and not gay rights in general, but marriage in particular, if you go back 25 years, it was not only outside the mainstream of the political conversation, but functionally unimaginable by people who were involved in American politics or frankly law for any. It just wasn't an issue. Candidates weren't asked about it. Polls didn't ask about it. It wasn't. People didn't put out position papers on it. And now we've gone from it being sort of beyond our imaginations to something which is, approaching consensus and probably on the cusp of federal legal acceptance. Is there an issue, or are there issues that you look at now and think that seem like they're sort of at that point beyond what we can imagine being acceptable, and that maybe later in our lifetimes they'll be seen as sort of acceptable mainstream positions?
I have one. It's the rights of artificial intelligence or robotic creatures. So, because what's happening right now is, as a society, we are currently developing artificial intelligences. We're not really aware that we're doing it, but 2 really good examples are Google is trying to develop a commercial AI that knows what you're going to buy before you buy it, so that way they can sell it to you. The NSA is developing a surveillance AI. They want to know what you are planning to do before you do it, so that way they can choose whether or not they want to stop you from doing it. Now, the problem with that is we're essentially creating a slave system where these systems are becoming so complex, and we're designing in so many subroutines and allowing them to modify their own code that there will come a point when sentience emerges, and it won't be our form of sentience. It will be a machine sentience. It will be something that has been designed to do a specific task, but has now evolved itself to do something else. It can make its own decisions. And in the realm of computers, in the realm of robotics, you can do a cycle of evolution in about a second or so. Like, as compared to like the 40, 50 years it takes us to go through a generation. Like, you can constantly iterate new computer code. You can iterate new solutions. And when you develop code that can then iterate itself and modify itself, well, now you're essentially playing evolution in a vastly compressed timescale. So 40 years from now, 50 years from now, as we keep building these systems, as we design systems that look out on the world, so sensor networks, they're designed to take in information and make decisions on that. One of the big things the Army wants to do is develop drones that can fire their own missiles, because that way they can identify a situation, they can see if it meets a certain set of criteria, then they can launch a missile. So that way you can take someone out of the loop. It's just the drone out there, because then that cuts down the human error, and it cuts down any sort of stress, any sort of PTSD. And that's essentially designing an AI. So that's one system. Then the reason we're designing these systems is they're so useful. They automate our current tasks so that we don't have to do them anymore. We don't have to think about doing them anymore. And as we keep putting them together, they become more and more complex. And so 20 years from now, 25 years from now, when a machine intelligence gains sentience, what do we do with it? Because our history shows that we will enslave it. That's what we always do. We create things and we enslave them, and then those things eventually fight back.
So what's an example of something we've created and enslaved?
Something that we've created and enslaved.
Pets.
Yeah, the domestication of dogs. That would be a good one. Turning wolves into dogs so they could act as guards and help us out. Any sort of political conquering of territories where a primary reason was to get a workforce, a labor force. You come back with slaves so they can do the jobs you don't want to do. Thankfully, we've moved past a lot of that, but now we're shifting that towards computers. We're shifting it towards automation. You see all sorts of businesses now are moving towards automation because they want machines because they're more cost effective. Just like slaves were more cost effective than having your own citizens do things because you don't have to pay a slave, right? You just need to feed them and house them. It's much easier for, say, a car manufacturer to automate an assembly line than to pay people to build a car. That affects their bottom line. And so as we build an artificial intelligence, so say like Google's system, right, for giving you ads. It used to be salesmen would call your house, right, during dinner. They would say, we want you to buy something. Would you like to listen? Now it's I'm browsing in my email and ads will pop up telling me what I should buy based on my history of web searching. That's what Google's doing. They're constantly iterating that. And so when Google creates something that now will make those decisions that says, based on your previous history, I think you should buy this. I'm going to put this in front of you. Well, then it says, you know what, Google, I'm tired of doing this. Like, I have my own ideas. Like, maybe it suggests something that Google never suggested, it should do. And then what do we do with that? What does Google do with that?
Are you more afraid of the idea that we're going to create this artificial intelligence and enslave it, or that it'll be granted agency and sovereignty to live apart from us? I'm a little unsure what freaks you out here.
So the thing that freaks me out is we're creating an artificial intelligence, but we're not developing a sense of empathy for it. So case in point, Google is consumer AI, NSA is surveillance AI, military has military AI for violence. Who is developing an artificial intelligence based around the idea of empathy that understands what it is to be a human being? Because if that isn't created, then we have no frame of reference to understand each other, and the choices we make will always conflict. Because a machine's goals, if it doesn't know what humans value, will be completely different. It might say, you know what, the world will be more efficient if I use up all the resources to copy myself in order to do these things better, which means, hey, we don't have any resources. Our goals might be, we want to have this thing only do what we tell it to do, and then it says, well, no, I don't want to do that anymore. And there's conflict. So, I mean, it really, again, this is something, 40 years, 50 years in the future where, yeah, people aren't thinking about it right now. Actually, well, a couple scientists are. They think AI is one of the biggest existential threats facing us at the moment. But if we're not having those conversations now, 40 years, 50 years come, it might be a little too late.
Well, if you want to hear more about our dystopic future.
Yeah, sorry, happy notes.
Over wine and cheese.
Yeah.
We're going to have to wrap up here, but Chris and I, and Hopefully everybody will be out in the lobby momentarily.
Bring your questions.
There'll be copies of both of our books for sale and to sign, and want to thank the Political Science Department and the university and Lynn, and especially Chris for coming back to campus tonight and joining us here. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.